Thank you to all of the attendees for joining us for the California Fire Science Seminar Series. Um, my name is Ajinkya Desai, and I will be your host for today. I am currently a PhD candidate in Professor Tirtha Banerjee's Boundary Layers and Turbulence Lab at UC Irvine. I work on wildland fire atmosphere interactions, and I'm a member of the student committee who assisted in organizing the California Fire Science Seminar Series. The California Fire Science Seminar Series is organized and supported by the California Fire Science Consortium, the Fire Research Group, the University of California at Berkeley, and the University of California at Merced. The student committee, I would like to point out, was also vital to the success of this seminar series, which included 18 students and postdocs from across the United States who helped select the speakers and topics for the seminar series. And also, just so you know, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the California Fire Science Consortium website and YouTube channel, so that's something to be aware of. After today's presentation, there will be a Q&A session. However, feel free to add any questions that you have to the Q&A chat throughout the presentation. Briefly about today's speaker. So today's seminar itself, Lessons Learned from Los Angeles, Clues in the Ashes, Signs of Hope, will be presented by Jana Valakovic. Jana Valakovic is the County Director, Forest Advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, and a member of UC Agricultural and Natural Resources Fire Network, specializing in community resilience and the built environment. She is a member of the Governor's Wildfire Forest Resilience Task Force and other state fire policy work groups, co-lead of the Northern California region of the California Fire Science Consortium, and a founding member of the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council. She has also co-authored many papers on fire behavior in California forests and the intersection of fire performance and hope and landscape design, and is interested in helping communities adapt to wildfire. So with that, please join me in welcoming Jana.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar series and choosing this talk among the so many great options out there. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with the consortium as well as this audience. And I look forward to sharing some of my work of recent in the Los Angeles area, as well as connecting that to some of the other efforts I've done in the built environment. To help me out and to give me a little sense of guidance around who's in the room, I know we have a staggering number of people who pre-registered, but I can see we're already over 250 people now. Would you mind launching a couple of polls just to help me get a sense of who's available, who's in the room today, and help me feel like it's a little more real? So there's two questions here. Basically, what brings you to this webinar? And then if you were to describe kind of who you're representing today, that would help me be a better communicator. So just take a minute to have people respond to those poll questions, and then we'll launch them, and that will help me participate better in this conversation. So maybe Ajinka, can you close the poll and produce the results, or Katanya or Autumn, whoever is doing that, that would be great. All right, so it looks about 20% of you are just curious about the LA fires, 10% work in LA and are looking towards rebuilding, 63% are trying to bring back results to their community, and then there's some others, so great to know. Sounds like we've got more people coming from outside the LA basin, so that's good to know. And then who do you represent? So we've got 16% fire agencies, 30% community organizations, some academics, researchers, some involved in rebuilding, some just general public, and some policymakers. Wow, okay, super diverse audience. Thank you very much. Really appreciate having that information. So I'm a bit of a post-fire chaser, if you will, and I like to play a little bit in the CSI space, trying to explore what makes a difference in why you see some homes make it through a conflagration like we've just seen in LA, and some homes succumb. And so I've been fortunate to do other post-fire work and had the opportunity to take two trips to Los Angeles this January and early February to look at these transition points, the points as shown here with the arrows where there was a building that has been consumed by fire adjacent to one that has not. And so, what makes the one more vulnerable and one more capable of surviving? So those are the questions that I sought after to answer. And if you're new to this conversation, just a little orientation of where the Palisades fire is respective to the Eaton fire. They're far apart from each other by driving time. They're all in the LA basin. And I've been able to visit both of those fire footprints, and this has got the DINS data on top of it. That's what you see, the damage inspection data, looking at homes that are buildings that have been lost and those that are damaged versus survived. So just for context as to where we're working. And I just want to start by saying, I hope this talk isn't triggering for anyone. I'm going to talk about real communities, and my heart goes out to all those that are affected. I can be a little dispassionate about the impact because I'm looking at it from a learning opportunity, and I feel very blessed that I don't know anybody in this in these actual images, so it's easier for me to talk about it analytically and not be talking about real people's lives. So I get that this is hard for a lot of folks. So I think for those of you who've not been in Los Angeles and not had the chance to see this, there are these transition points where you can see, here's a building that survives, one that is lost, and one that survives, one that is lost. And so, what contributes to this signature and this pattern? That was what I am curious about learning about. So what I'll say is that you see more in the vegetation and in the surviving structures than you do in the ashes. So most of my work really focuses on looking at those surviving buildings and trying to understand what was their secret sauce, if you will, like what made the difference in their survivorship. And I often look at the vegetation as well, because I can see the direction that the wind was coming. I can see the direction that the fire was coming. So you can see these tipping Italian cypress. So in this case, the wind and fire were coming downslope in this direction. And so I'm looking for a combination of different signs and signals to help support the work that I'm gonna share with you. I was on two explorations. The first one was with the CAL FIRE DINS team, and I want to give a shout out to Randy Northrup, who was very kind to escort me around. And I've also been in partnership with the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. There's some of my friends and colleagues there, and on a second trip with some other folks. So I'd like also to give a shout out to Dr. Steve Quarles, who's our emeritus advisor, who has mentored me and taught me so much in this field. Also worked for the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So he is a really foundational contributor to the way I see the world, and I think how we're shifting in our understanding of the vulnerabilities of our communities. What I want to talk about today, and I want to give some caveats. Here we are in the fire science world, and what I'm talking about is not statistical data. There is uncertainty, so all good scientists have to put those disclosures there. This really represents a rapid assessment approach, and I shared that I target specific locations within each fire footprints. I've got 4 days of time in the field, looked at approximately 50 homes, and I was on two trips, January 15th and 16th, a week after the fire ignited, and then a couple weeks later in early February. So that being said, there's still a lot that you can learn in that rapid assessment approach, and it's very similar to the work that other groups do, such as the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and I'll give you a link to their most recent report at the end of this talk. So what are the big ideas from the LA fires? What were the big things that I came home with? Well, first, I don't live in Los Angeles, so I was limited to the media, limited to what I could see through video presentation over social media, as well as what was being displayed through many different media events. And what I perceived to be happening was somewhat influenced by what I've experienced in other fire events. And so the message I had in my head before I got there was that there would be relatively little firefighter intervention because the focus is on evacuation. In these very rapidly escalating events, the first priority is always to focus on life and life protection. And so I assumed that I wouldn't see much sign of firefighter intervention. And so I assumed that the structures that I'd looked at would be those that survived, would be those that made it on their own and that had some element in their design, their maintenance, the products perhaps they were built with that had the right stuff. And so when you go out to look at an actual situation, there's a lot more complexity to that. And what I'll say is that in LA, the exposures are more uneven than I anticipated. So if you look at the photo on the right-hand side, you can see these paper boxes right in the front area of this house. That front area is actually in the direction of the fire. But you would anticipate that if that building took on a bunch of embers, that those boxes should not have survived. And so what's out there is a product of how the wind sculpted and shaped and moved through the terrain. And in some cases, houses are dipped down, and so they're out of the force of the wind, they're out of the wind channels. And so you've got structures that took, like this one here, almost no exposure. And then you have structures where you can see signs of intervention, where there were firefighters that made a difference. And what really surprised me is that there was a whole lot more firefighter intervention than I anticipated. So what you see in terms of the homes that survive are mostly a reflection of both of those two things, where they didn't get exposure or there was someone there that gave a helping hand. So those are two thoughts around LA. The third thought is that when I look at building styles, materials, and kind of the aesthetic of Southern California, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and it's going to be more easy in Los Angeles than in some other locations. I was in Mill Valley over the weekend, and Mill Valley is going to be a lot harder to figure out how to disconnect the fuels, create the defensible space zone that we term Zone 0, which is the first 5 feet, 0 to 5 feet from the structure, and really this issue of how do we retrofit homes to be more resistive of fire exposure is more challenging in some places. I think in Southern California, it's really quite doable. And so that's kind of like the big take-home stuff that I see in relation to the Los Angeles fires. I want to say that this is informed by a lot of work that gets us to this point, in particular work by NIST and Alexander Marangides, and we can look at NIST Technical Note 2205, which gets us this concept around the wildland-urban interface and structure to parcel to community level exposures. And here, this little graphic on the right, while hard to see, talks about structure separation distance and how the vulnerabilities change as the structures have closer proximity to each other within the lots and between the lots. And so the community scale matters. So what we've largely been talking about in the fire protection community are ways that we can reduce exposure by managing the fuels, and the ways that we can harden the structures by dealing with different levels of materials, different installation practices, looking at it in a maintenance framework so that we can remove some of those vulnerabilities. So what I want to conclude with in my opening slide is that there really is a message of hope in my mind, having seen what I have on the ground, is that there are things that are within our capacity, things within our grasp that as homeowners and those who advise others, that are achievable and doable. And many of these things are not very expensive. So I am optimistic going forward that through this tragedy, we can find a new level of will and motivation perhaps to do some of the things that manage the fuels, manage the structures, and really scale up to a community level of impact. So today's talk, I want to talk in a short amount of time around kind of how we got to where we are in terms of our evolution around fire mitigation. I want to talk a little bit about fire exposures using the terms direct flame contact, radiant heat, and embers. just a hint of a couple things from Paradise and Colorado, where I've been involved in some post-fire work there, and then bring it back to the Los Angeles environment and talk about interventions, connected fuels, and structure resilience and weaknesses. So not a lot of time to hit a bunch of topics, but just to make sure that we're all on the same vocabulary level, we talk about fire exposures in three terms. Direct flame contact is illustrated in these graphics where fire is moving from somewhere else towards the structure. We also talk about embers, which is the wind distributed bits of firebrands or burning pieces of vegetation or parts of structures that get moved in the air column and find weak points. Here showing around the vegetation around the structure, or perhaps entering a vent or an open window. And then we also use the language of radiant heat, which is heat transfer either from vegetation or as illustrated in the one on the right, with a subordinate building here that ignites, and there's heat pressure that comes from that causes a fail point, and that's typically seen in the windows. And in Los Angeles, we saw lots of issues associated with windows. So my work is really about trying to think about ways to mitigate those pathways, disconnect those pathways, and they work or the things that I recommend are in this combination of defensible space, so fuel management to interrupt those fuel pathways, and then hardening the structure and mitigating some of the potential exposure weak points in those structures. So, I want to just acknowledge that when you get the intensity of wind that we saw in Los Angeles for the duration that we did, you end up with a lot of firebrands. And this is from a colleague, Faraz Hedayati at IBHS. This is on his LinkedIn post. Gotten a lot of views of it. I'm, including the link for it. And so, he writes, in just 5 seconds, thousands of embers are generated from small fuel loads, some launching from the ground level, others from treetops. And while many burn out, countless embers rain down on downwind homes, striking siding, bouncing off the wall, accumulate at the base of the wall. And, anything that's within that first 5 feet or zone 0 is likely to be ignited. So, short flames start to ignite buildings, growing quickly into tall flames, which stretch and then bend over or tilt into the wind and creating this, what feels like unstoppable destruction. So in my hand is an example of a cold ember. That's, something that had been moved as an illustration. And just to say that in this set of fires, we experience a lot of ember generation, and embers are really capable of finding those weak points in our buildings and exploiting them. So I've used this photo many times. I think it does a fantastic job of showing how embers can move through the air column. There's a lot of motion illustrated in this photo, courtesy of the Los Angeles Times, where the embers smash against the wall, they fall to the base, and that's why they collect at this base here. And so you can see all that yellow and red and orange, and that's really where ignition is happening at the transition from the horizontal to the vertical along that wall line. So having combustible items at the base of the wall is really quite problematic, because it enables for direct flame contact on the structure, and depends how well hardened the structure is as to whether or not it can resist that. So there's a lot of things to be aware of when a building is subject to ember exposure. We talk also a lot about where those unique vulnerabilities are in structures, in their vents, in the rain gutters, in the roof to wall interactions, and how fire can basically run down a fence, and that can be the fuse or the wick that takes fire directly to the structure. So these are some of the things that we know are likely to occur. And the question is, how do you apply that in a situation like Los Angeles and the Eaton and Palisades fire? So much of my education work and extension work is really trying to help people see where those vulnerabilities are in particular structures and talk about them specifically, and then figure out what the best course of mitigation or maintenance might be. So not going to go through this in detail, but just to kind of hint at that there is a lot of collective evidence and good management practices that people can deploy. So I just thought I'd try and illustrate these fire pathways and transitions. And so in this clip art from PowerPoint here, you've got wind moving a fire, and in this case, it's moving through the vegetation. The vegetation then eventually connects with a fence, and then you've got the fence carrying the fire directly to the structure. You also have wind picking up embers from this burning vegetation and launching them ahead of the flaming front, and then likely creating new spot fires or exploiting weaknesses within the buildings themselves. And you can have multiple models where you can have multiple fences running in different directions. And then the fire then transitions from this vegetation-based one to one where you've got interactions between buildings, and density really becomes a vulnerability because you have so much close proximity to each other. In both the Eaton and Palisades fire, we've got a lot of buildings that are built in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. So these are buildings that have been around for a while. So they start to have wear and tear in them. The materials that are used can start to break down, or they're maybe just not the most resistant to fire exposure. So, we hope that you don't get fire movement into these urban environments. But when you do, that's where things get really complicated. So in Los Angeles, we have that transition from the wildland. We have connected fuels that bring it from the wildland to the structures, and then we move into a structure-to-structure type exposure. And you've got multiple pathways for fire to continue to expose each of those structures. So, this is not unique. Los Angeles sits in context with the fact that we've lost over 57,000 structures in California in the last decade. It is a tremendous amount of buildings. And embers are really one of the biggest contributors to that building ignition scenario. And so, just trying to bring that message home so folks can understand that this is a very urgent need to figure out how to create more defense on each of our properties and our structures. So, again, looking over the last decade, we've got the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa, we've got the Carr fire in Redding, we have the Camp fire in and around the communities of Paradise, the Hopkins fire in Ukiah, Coastal fire in Orange County. Each of these have some unique attributes, and then they also have some elements of commonality. And all of those, really are related to vegetation to house, and then vulnerabilities, typically with vents and embers. There are some nuances within that. The Marshall Fire, which was in Boulder, Colorado, and these are all fires that I've been involved doing some post-fire work, except for Lahaina, Maui. They all have some kind of signature. And the Marshall Fire was really about how wood fences served as the wick to connect to structures. And that's because in Boulder, Colorado, there's not a lot of natural topography or vegetation to give privacy. And so we use fences to create privacy. So, I get the tension and I get the understanding as to why we have these built environments in the way that we do and what amenities they provide, but, trying to help recognize where those vulnerabilities are. So in Paradise, radiant heat became a really big factor for the damaged homes. So here's a visual from the, Paradise, California, where you can see that, where are the green trees? They're not near the foundations of these fully consumed buildings. They tend to be in places that are farther separated from buildings. And that's because homes really can become the most combustible part of the landscape. And we see that you've got home to home spread here, which is then contributing to damage to the vegetation and the tall trees, more so than a flaming front just connecting through. So we get that ember distribution, we get then ignition in one building, and then you've got this building to building interaction, which sort of changes the nature of the fire. My colleagues, Eric Knapp and Steve Quarles and Nels Johnson and I put together a paper looking at the effect of California's building codes and how those were contributing factors to building survivorship. And I've made the link here. But just some of the visuals here, I just want you to see is that, where a block is intact, it's intact. But once you get ignition in one part of that block, you tend to have this exposure issue that the other buildings are causing. And what we found in Paradise was that 73% of the homes were within 18 meters of a destroyed structure. So that's about 54 feet. So this, building to building relationship is a really big driver. When you plop that into Los Angeles, you've got higher structure density and you've got closer buildings in proximity to each other. So, that distance is even more important. Here's just some visuals from Boulder, Colorado, where you can see how this labyrinth of fences connected communities together. And these fences really became the fuse where you've got grassland, embers to grassland, grass to wood fence, and the wood fence is what brings the fire to the structure. So using that as a backdrop, what do we learn from LA that contributes to our collective understanding? What's new, what's different? And so I'm going to try something new for me, and I'm going to show some videos. So here's an example of looking at the transition between, this is in Palisades, this is right on the beach, and so I'm curious about, why does this building make it? And so let's see if this works.
This attached gate was wood. Looks like maybe someone pushed it away. I'll walk along the side of this building. You can see the tempered glass breakage from this burning side of this building. Here's where the gate was. And definitely there was firefighter response. You can see here that the gate was cut away, and that disconnected this burning building from this one. This building took a lot of heat. While it was tempered glass, I look at the buckle up there, and both layers were damaged.
So that's an interesting example here. That is a 3-pane tempered glass window. I've never seen one of those before, but huge amount of radiant heat exposure. And even though the window's damaged, I mean, I'm going to call this success because flames don't enter that structure, which is really amazing. So a little help from firefighter intervention to cut that gate, and then the resistive properties of tempered glass, which is so much more than annealed glass. And we're able to see success right at that transition line. So that's kind of interesting. As I visited these properties, I'm looking for, clues, pieces of story. If some of you saw my blog, I talk about the squirt gun, and at this house, you can see buckets and water, just this mad rush by what I'm going to assume is the homeowner. I don't really know, trying to make a difference here in this location. And, you also see other efforts where some community members took on having a pump so they could pump water from their pools to have an additional water resource, and to some success, not completely in many others. So, I want to say that the pump to me is not one that I'm feeling super confident about based on what I saw, because the conditions really escalated. And so, you really needed to know what you were doing and be prepared and dressed for that setting. But you can see these, valiant efforts of buckets, of blenders, and people trying to make some stand before they felt like they needed to leave. And so that is the emotionality and the heart wrenching part that I think I experience when I do this work. Here's some more examples of gates. Here is the fence came, if you can see my cursor, moving towards the front end of the screen. Sorry, no, actually the fence went, to the right of the screen. Fire comes down the fence, it turns at the 90 degrees, and then it starts to move towards the structure. And here you can see the cut line where some defensive action was taken. So the fix on something like this is relatively easy, and that is that, replace that gate attachment with something non-combustible so that the fire doesn't transmit from the fence to the house. Just cut the wick off as it starts to approach the structure. Here, there are lots of examples of how people put vegetation in places that is risky. And you can see these ladder, we talk about ladder fuels in forests where fire can stair step and climb up from low vegetation up the ladder of the branches to something taller. Well, here's an example of how in 2 places we had full ignition of that vegetation, and it was putting pressure on the under eave areas of both of these structures. In both cases, there was someone who came in and made a difference. Garbage cans, garbage receptacles certainly are interesting. I'm not exactly clear how they ignite, but once they do, I don't know if the wind blows the lid open or if they get to how they get knocked over necessarily, but a lot of heat comes off of those garbage cans and receptacles as the fire progresses. And so, you know, I think I see when I'm doing this work evidence that the garbage can is sort of part of the formula. You know, they're complicated to manage, but maybe there's something that we can do upon evacuation if you have the time, is to get that stuff away from our structures. So just giving you some visuals of some of the things that I see. You know, I'm basically looking for pathways of damage to the structure. And here's an example where I feel pretty confident that it was the bushes in front of this building, which is stucco-like. It's not quite, I think we call it EID, not a little different than the old-fashioned stucco, but by the level of charring and consumption on these bushes, I think this is the pathway that led to the failing point of the windows here. The reason the building hasn't collapsed in this case is because this structure, which was built, I think, in the 90s, uses steel framing, which helps keep the walls erect. Not necessarily helpful for fire protection itself, but that's why you see in a lot of my images more buildings standing up than just ash piles. So let's see, I want to show you another video here. And this is in the Eaton fire. And I don't have any narration over the top of it, but fire basically is traveling through the backyards. And there's this really good usage of a patio. There's some vegetation that's close to it. A lot of block walls are common here. Here's a metal gate. And you can see that they more or less have that first 5 feet clear. Got some consumption of some things that are left in there. Metal gate again here, then transitions to a wood gate, which someone has forced open. And then when you look over the wall, you can see basically complete loss of the adjacent building. So there's some interesting, observations around how walls affect the transmission of heat and give some more heat protection. But then as you come towards the front of the building, you can see that we had consumption in the wood mulch. And then here's where the water shutoffs were. That's where the garden hose is. And so there definitely was ignition around that building. But I look at that and I go, wow, there's just a few details that would have, helped even more in this particular example. Here's another one. I'm going to flip it around a bit so that we can get some wider view on what this looks like, where we're at this interesting place where we've got some damage and some lost structures. Mountain view behind us. And you can see the damage on the stucco siding. And it's a lot of fascia damage, to my surprise. What we've been seeing in this fire is that the stucco construction helps hold in the heat as the building burns, and then it later collapses, which was likely what is slowing some of the heat damage onto the adjacent building. But walking down this way, you can see that this gate was really critical in not wicking the fire to the building, where here is the remnants of the wooden fence that was separating the two properties. So a great example how they disconnected the fence to the structure, and I think that was really key in that example. So here's another story. This is in Altadena. This home's built, I wouldn't say 40s, 50s, somewhere in there. I'm using the garage, which is behind the images here, as some evidence where the garage has single pane louvered windows, and the front house does not. Somewhere along the line, they replaced the windows and added these double pane glass windows, which I am going to attribute to being really helpful in protecting this structure from the amount of heat that comes from the adjacent one. So if you flip around and stand at the garage here, this is what it looks like when you flip backwards. And so there was a fence that had wood panels, but it had masonry block in between. The wood fence burns out, but these windows take on a lot of heat, and there's some broken panes in here, but they don't fail completely. And this building survives. I don't see firefighter intervention on this structure. Maybe I missed it, but that design or that detail of upgraded windows, I think, was really an important factor in contributing to survivorship of this building. There also isn't an overhang here, so you don't get that trapping of the heat underneath the eaves. This house has kind of, a tight haircut, I might call it. So I think that allows some of the heat to go up and not get trapped. So there's a couple other details that I think contribute in this particular situation. So it's great to see these products in action and see, upon exposure that they can do well. There are a lot of vinyl windows. Many of them are double paned, which is fantastic. Double pane far better than single pane. There's lots of old single pane windows out there too. And I think most of those buildings failed. But one of the things I observed in the double paned example with vinyl is that the glazing here looks like it's a weak point from radiant heat. It begins to deform, not exactly melt, but deform. And then, and that's kind of what this stringy looking thing is. You can see it also on the greenhouse. And what happens in those situations is that if it deforms enough, sometimes the panel of glass will fall out. And then, it's like taking the storm door off. And so then the second panel either falls or breaks itself. If you run down the structure in this case, this is an example where we had full glass breakage. The panel didn't fall out, but there's full glass breakage, but the window screen stays intact, and that keeps the embers out. So the window screen turns out to be a really good line of defense in that building there. So these are just little bits of collections of stories that we're seeing.
On this property, here's a excellent zone 0, and that really seemed to hold this structure together. And moving around, there are a few combustible items that are near to this building, but for the most part, the patio provided a lot of protection.
So it's
over here, you can see that the adjacent structure was consumed by fire. But again, another good example of zone 0. The fire did start to come over the top of the block wall where it's covered in this woody climbing vine. And here you can see an example of where fire just about started on this structure. But through defensive action, and I'll get my shadow out of the way, I'll flip around. Someone came through, kicked open the gate. I'm guessing the gate was locked, enabling them to open the gate, maybe throw some water on it, and keep the gate from carrying the fire to the structure. So the adjacent structure looks like all the other ones we've seen in this community. But here, you can see that this house made it through. Working
in these communities, we also see a lot of these usage of non-combustible walls, many of them masonry block, and they're commonly covered in vegetation to kind of soften the edges and make them look a little prettier. I don't know what I want to say about this. I would say that I see a lot of that vegetation burned or consumed, and I can't tell how much it serves as the wick, but certainly covering your non-combustible wall with something that is combustible is not, in my mind, a best practice. So I think in the rebuilding efforts, thinking about how we manage the visuals between two structures and when there is usage of this masonry block, I think is an important issue. At the same time, the masonry block helps to hold some of the heat from one building's heat towards the other and provides a little more protection. So the masonry block walls, I think, are useful in these examples here. And it's the first time that I've interacted in a building where you see, or in an environment where you see a lot of those. Here's some more examples of the steel framing and how it keeps these structures in with the walls still standing. Kind of looks a little bit more like a ghost town. And just if you poke in, you can start to see on the right-hand side what that steel framing looks like. And that's how you get these kind of interesting images. I can see in the chat someone saying, well, how can I tell in the from the trees which way the fire was coming? And I think in this picture, you can really see how each of them are in these Italian cypress. They're kind of leaning towards to the left-hand side of the image. The wind is coming from the right-hand side of the image to the left-hand side of the image. We call it the freeze. And you get this kind of drying and heating effect where the vegetation basically gets frozen in place. And that gives you a nice sign of which direction the wind was coming from. So what do we do? And I'm going to, try and wrap up this talk. There's a lot to be said. There are a lot of big things to think about here. I just want to reinforce that exposures in Los Angeles were uneven. Not every structure that survived took on heat or took on embers or had direct flame contact. And so they may not offer great illustration of having the right stuff. I just, I want to be thankful and grateful that those people have buildings to come back to. So, not a critique, but really appreciation, but just to understand that when you see a structure that does survive, you don't always know what its story was. And there are many examples of firefighter intervention that really made a difference. And some of those are really small actions. And so if you saw my blog this last week, I really talk about this idea. Well, how do you interpret that? And I think what it means to me is that, just needing a little bit of help is a huge improvement over needing a lot of help. And what I see in Los Angeles is a general style of construction that I think is pretty modifiable, is able to create more fuel disconnection, tends towards this idea of the first 5 feet generally not having combustible items within those first 5 feet. So being able to implement the new defensible space zone called Zone 0. And because stucco is so common there, it won't be that hard to retrofit existing structures to upgrade their vents so that they can resist embers. So I'm really optimistic about the potential for retrofitting and designing better and building better in Los Angeles going forward, and in other parts of California and other fire-prone locations throughout the West or throughout the United States. Let's see, why can't I not? Oh, there we go. Sorry, I was having trouble advancing slides there. And the details matter. So here's a conclusionary slide where we look at a structure that was recently added to this lot in the Eaton Fire footprint. It's in Altadena, and what you're looking at is this cool cactus garden, and what you see are basically the burned out areas of a set of steps and of garden beds. The reason I'm showing this photo is because the new building was built largely towards the items that we talk about in California's building code designed for exterior fire exposure called Chapter 7A, had tempered glass windows, had no under-eave vents, had first 5 feet without combustible materials. There was fire all over this property, and it wicked through this property, but it had no ability to transmit to the new structure. And so here is what seems like an oasis, but an example of a set of actions that made the difference here in that building's survival. So, I think it's great to be able to see these in real life and move from experiments where, we can design experiments to test products and test assemblies in labs to being able to see it in the face of really intense fire exposure. So, how do we mitigate wildfire risk? There are many options at the home scale. There are collective actions that happen at the neighborhood scale. And then as you start to aggregate those all out, that's what really helps build that robust quality within communities. And so, I just want to say that I want to thank you for joining me and sharing some of what I'm seeing here, and I hope that you all can bring back some messages to the communities that you work within around, ideas that there are details that matter, there are actions that can be taken. And I'll just show you one illustration. The top image here is from a building that survives, and this person added the 1/8 inch metal mesh screening over their existing vents. They spray painted them so they looked like there's basically a big block of screening here. They stapled it up, spray painted it around, made sure that the vent still had openings within it. This building survives. And it's built no different than the one down below, but I have to think that some of these small actions make a difference in contributing to the building and the top end surviving. So, as I conclude, what does the future look like in the LA Basin? I think it's going to be really up to LA and the community there to help define that. We've got lots of vulnerabilities in our built environment, and examples of how we build these communities into places where access and evacuation is really complicated. And so, we've got to figure out ways that we can create temporary refuge areas, redundant access so that there's alternate routes so people can get out, and really harden the structures so that they are much more robust to the types of fire exposures that they will experience into the future. And I'm going to wrap up with a shout out to some of my colleagues at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. They just produced their observations paper last week, and it represents around 250 homes, kind of similar sets of themes and observations. But if you'd like to kind of look at it in report form, that's something that's accessible in that link there. So with that, I think I will stop sharing and see if we can have some conversation.
Thank you so much, Yana. That was a really insightful presentation. We would like to open it up to questions now. And in the interest of time, I request that questions be asked in the Q&A box. I can see there's a lot of questions that have come up during the presentation itself. I could start us off with one, but Yana, if you feel like there's a question that you would like to pick up, feel free to jump in as well. There's a question by Carla Kellums. How effective is community planning in preventing fire deviation? For example, homes being further apart, underground utilities, green irrigated open space around homes, trees for wind block, topography considerations, and for example, canyons versus flats, etc.
Yeah, so the question is, when you tie it all together, how effective is that? Is that kind of how you interpret it? Can you tell me which one it is? I think that's a fantastic question. And the challenging part is that as a scientist and as a researcher, I can't design communities and burn one and not and set them up where there's sort of side by side comparisons. So we're left to these post-fire investigations, that work that NIST does and IVHS does. We're left to the experimentation that we can do at the small scale, which at the IVHS lab, is at the place where you can do two structures to each other and you can look at structure transmission from one structure to the next. And then you have to use models to start to aggregate that out. It's only in these post-fire environments can you start to put all those pieces together. So, I think what we're trying to do is make best practices and recommendations through a series of linked pieces of strong evidence and then some interpolation between those. So I can't quite weight the value of each of those actions, but I would say that they generally all matter. And I think the first thing to think about is those pathways of radiant heat, embers, and direct, flame contact, and trying to make sure that the building that is built is designed to be able to withstand those types of exposures. And then from the community perspective, that there's a way for that community to get a good alert system and be able to get out. Those are some of the key elements to me in terms of you need an evacuation system, and then you need structures to be much more robust overall. And that, set of collective actions all come together. I think there's ways to design structures that are more simplistic and catch embers less and have, more likelihood of reducing some vulnerability. So when you end up with those complex roof lines where you end up with roof and walls intersecting with each other, that creates more complexity. And so there's additional hardening that needs to be done in that way. Our style of construction right now is really with these very complicated roof lines, and that aesthetic, I think, creates a little more vulnerability for us. So maybe we can start to shift that aesthetic a little bit. It would make it easier for us to create more resilience or resistance in our buildings if that occurred. So how's that for some set of answers there?
That's great. If I could ask a follow-up, like if I could pick a follow-up question to what you just some of the things that you just touched upon regarding home hardening. There's a question by Jody Mendelson. What are the options for retrofitting historic homes that are all wood siding and exposed eaves? Is intumescent paint worthwhile?
Yeah, fantastic question. And, I just want to say, like, I love building and design and structures, and I'm kind of a little bit of a closet architect. So I love the old buildings. And so prioritization, in my mind, the roof needs to be in good shape. And then the vents need to be upgraded so that they're not going to take on embers. And then the combustibles in the first 5 feet are really the three critical actions. So if you can implement zone 0, then that wood siding has much less of a chance of being exposed to direct flame contact. So think about those kind of pathways around some of those historic structures. The radiant heat piece gets a little more complicated with the beautiful single pane windows and such. And, there may be some deployable shutters that could be integrated into that house design. Maybe, if the homeowner has the wherewithal to put in some new windows that still match some of the old aesthetic, but use tempered glass. And, there are some companies that make some windows that, meet some of that older style and beauty. But just recognizing that the single pane windows are vulnerable, and that the wood siding is vulnerable, but you can at least move the combustibles away from the wood siding. And probably the stairs and how the houses, you approach the stairs and such. And I think you can do that in a way that it doesn't look like it's over modernized. It still has that aesthetic that the house was originally built with.
Sounds great. The next question is by Jennifer So. Is the idea that tree canopies can intercept embers from reaching the home only a theory, or is there existing or proposed research to address that?
There's been a lot of media around the question of, did tree canopies make a difference? And I don't know. And I think it's important as scientists to say that we don't know. I think we're looking for optimism in certain signs. I love trees. I'm a forester by training. Not all trees are equal. A lot of trees senesce leaves and hold on to them, and then they become this receptacle of dead and dying fuels in their canopies. So that's problematic. Often we don't have enough water to hydrate the trees that we have. I think what I perceive I see in Altadena and Palisades, and this is not statistically driven, is that micro topography made more of a difference than those tree lines likely did. I'm sure some people are going to take some issue with me on that statement, but that's what I think I see when I look at it, where you see, a little downslope and a little pocket in essence. And so the wind is going to blow right over the top of it and not get forced into the pocket as being more of a contributor. I do think that we also need to think about like what we saw in Paradise, where we're able to really get a statistical relationship between building survival and loss, and that the nearest neighbor loss is the biggest predictor of survival or loss than anything. So it may be in some of those tree-lined streets in Altadena, and I didn't go see them. So, again, from the vantage point I have, that some right things happen, and so you didn't get that domino effect from building to building, and yet we still have the trees in there, and the trees may be correlation and not causation. So sorry if that wasn't the answer you're looking for.
The next question is by Alex Wiseman, who was involved in fighting Santa Ana-driven fires in San Bernardino County. They say, I noticed approximately 10 feet wide, I suppose, 10 feet or meters, 10 feet wide cement line flood controlled ditches backed by 10-foot tall cinder block walls surrounded many WUI developments. Were these structures present and effective in the Palisades or Eaton fires?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I saw a number of those flood control ditches and cinder block walls, and I think they do make a difference because they create fuel discontinuity. So you can have fire in the surrounding slope and then it interacts with one of these flood control structures and it doesn't transmit. It doesn't have the ability to, continue down the slope. So I have to think that those have made some level of impact. And I saw probably 15 homes with examples like that. And saw the fire run down basically through them and then not hop into the yard because those non-combustible zones were created.
Okay. And there's a there's a question by an anonymous attendee. I believe I heard you say something in one of the videos about stucco holding in heat in a negative way. Can you say more about this?
Oh, not in
So,
a negative way. Yeah. So the stucco, in essence, what I think it creates is like a box that the contents within the building burn. And so the heat is not expanding out through the structure because it's being contained within the box until some kind of structural level of compromise happens. And then the stucco walls collapse in. And so it basically keeps some of that heat flux, some of that radiant heat contained for a longer time period. That might give time for some kind of firefighter intervention. I don't know exactly, but it's just an interesting observation to see how the stucco was performing in that environment. I don't have any real-time photo data or video data to be able to kind of manage that question or to draw from, but it's just my perception of what I'm seeing on the ground. Those walls also serve in that same way. The walls between properties, help contain some of that heat additionally, meaning that it's forcing most of the heat to go straight up as opposed to laterally.
And to your knowledge, there's a question by Jim Casper. To your knowledge, Yana, do you know if there'll be work to create frequency of occurrence or prioritized list of causes of failure, which might be helpful to property owners and communities to prioritize what work to do next? For example, focusing on updating windows and vegetation under windows.
Do you interpret that question to be in the retrofit or the rebuild environment? I'm sorry.
I think they're referring to the rebuilt environment.
Well, I think the rebuild environment is a really interesting question, and the piece of politics now is basically what's the difference between mandates and best management practices, and whether communities that are not prior to this subject to the fire hazard severity maps and the trigger to use Chapter 7A of the California Building Code are going to apply or not. If it were me, and if I were trying to rebuild in Paradise in Los Angeles, I would do every best practice that is recommended out there through what's in the California Building Code and the Defensible Space Code, even if it's not mandatory. So the question is that substantially more expensive? And we have a report from Headwaters Economics that does an analysis of what it costs to rebuild using Chapter 7A. And the price figure is about 3% greater than the total building. So I think one of the things that people need to think about is that a lot of the fire-related stuff, when they look at the potential cost of the rebuild structure, it deals with interior fire management. And so what we're just talking about is exterior-related details. So if you're in a community that's got high density between structures, meaning like 20 feet or less, I would use tempered glass windows where those structures are close to each other. That would be a significant improvement. Of course, you're going to have a Class A roof. I would probably use non-combustible siding given what's going on in terms of potential heat exposures. And I would make sure that Zone 0, that first 5 feet, has nothing combustible in it as a minimum standard. And I would really, employ a maintenance and management scheme to be able to figure out how to maintain those qualities and those attributes over time so that, the natural wear and tear doesn't, create that vulnerability going forward. If I'm retrofitting, Zone 0, absolutely making sure that the roof is in good shape and then starting to think about where there's radiant heat exposures, how to minimize or mitigate those if possible. And I think about all structures as being vulnerable. And so some people have garden sheds and outbuildings and stuff just to kind of get stuff out of sight, out of mind, but those can become the vulnerable first link. And so, all structures basically, if they're in close proximity to other buildings, need to be built to a more robust standard so that they don't become the pathway from that structure to the primary structure.
Thank you. The next question is by Alec Dara Abrams. When surviving damaged struct when so- not surviving, sorry, when surveying damaged structures, how do you take into account survivorship bias? That is the inability to analyze relevant aspects of destroyed structures with regard to detail and accuracy that we can analyze surviving structures.
Yeah, fantastic question. You just have to do your best. As I said, this is an observational project here, and you can't discount the things or the things you see necessarily. I'm not there to look for confirmation bias, but I'm certainly there to try and understand what the storyline was, what I can speculate. When you get to the much more detailed analyses that NIST does, that is done through a whole collection of interviews and conversations with fire personnel. If you can trace back the history, usage of video cameras and other details that can provide some additional independent analyses. That's not possible in this rapid context. I seek to have conversation with anyone who might be in the neighborhood, who might be able to talk about what they saw firsthand. But I'm just offering you some information around what I see, and take from it what you will, and look for more empirical based studies and look for mechanistic studies to really dig in. And we all have choices. So given what limited resources we have, I just think it's well worth investing in our homes, because most of our family assets and the protection of our communities is tied in our homes. And so I think every little bit can make a difference.
Got it. We are at time, so we do need to wrap up. And I do see that there are a lot of interesting questions that attendees had for you, Yana, which is testimony to the kind of presentation, the wonderful presentation, the slides that you had. But I'm gonna have to say that if you do have more questions, this is me addressing the attendees, please feel free to reach out to Yana via her LinkedIn profile. And as we wrap up today's session, I do want to thank everyone for joining us, especially Yana for the edifying presentation. We do have two upcoming webinars. One is on March 18th with Claire Borichter, who will be talking about the importance of human-ignited fire in the restoration of natural habitats, and a bonus webinar on March 19th by Sandy P. Harrison on some key issues in modeling wildfires. So please keep an eye out for those. And also for the webinar evaluation for this webinar that will be sent out soon. So
I think we have a post question here. And
oh,
yeah, so love to hear, any take-home points. This is just really for my own learning here to figure out, did I communicate effectively what I was trying to communicate? And I'm scanning the questions right now, and if I could just take one more minute around the intumescent paint question and then fences. What I guess really want to bring home to you is that the attachment to the gate, where the gate would typically lie, should be non-combustible. The parallel fence line has a whole set of vulnerabilities. Really depends how far away it is from the structure or not, and style of fences, they all seem to ignite in different ways. So I am concerned about fences in some situations and not in others. And so it's hard to make a blanket statement about them broadly. The intumescent paint and coating piece, I do want to call out for that. It's very hard to do independent verification of it in your particular setting with your particular weather and exposure issues. And so you see a fair bit of degradation in a number of those products. And to me, that's a last line of defense. I'd much rather see people do a bunch of the other maintenance stuff that we've been talking about before moving towards an aspirational hope out of some of those intumescent coatings, because they do weather and they weather unevenly and maybe not give you the product performance that you're seeking. So buyer beware around those. Anyway, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share some thoughts, and I appreciate the rich dialogue, and I'm sure that I've stimulated some questions, and I look forward to and continuing that along the way. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much for picking up some of those additional questions towards the end. Has the poll been answered? I can't actually see. Got it. Okay, so we're gonna give folks a few more minutes to answer the post-webinar poll.
Yeah, and I'm okay. I see another question around the campfire in paradise, and uh, just love to say that I think there are many things that can be done, and there are many surviving homes in paradise, and the homes that survive are in newer construction. Some of them are after the California Building Code update and development for exterior performance in relation to fire. So we call that Chapter 7A of the California Building Code. I think that's all trending us in the right direction. I can't guarantee that if you do every one of these actions that the building will survive, but the odds are changing and they're shifting in your favor. And so, the more we think about the pathways and how to mitigate those pathways for fire, I think the better off we'll be. But we live in a place that's fire prone, and removal of fire is not something that will happen consistently. And fire brings many beneficial qualities too. So, there's a lot of work to do in the wildlands and the vegetation to be able to produce fire that has a lot of good effects from the ecosystem perspective, and then doesn't cause a damaging point to our built environment, our built communities. So, I just want to encourage you to feel like there's some possibility throughout all of this. And the stuff we're talking about here, I am just as freaked out as I am about Sedona, Arizona, when I go to communities like that, where we tend to like really nestle our structures in lots of vegetation so they're not visible and distracting from the beautiful surroundings. And, there are just many, many examples throughout the United States where there's huge vulnerability, and it's challenging, I think, for people to see themselves in the fire issue. I speak to lots of communities and they're like, I don't live in a forest, so it's not my problem. Well, when you look at Altadena and Palisades, is it a forested environment? No, it's not. Fire, has impact across many vegetation types, and we actually lose more structures in homes that are not in the forested settings than we do in forested settings. So, trying to kind of detangle and change our kind of cultural understanding of where fire risk is, I think, is one of our modern challenges. So, my hat's off to you all for your work in this and your study in this, and I wish you all great success going forward.
Thank you so much, Yana. And thank you again for those really insightful slides and for all of your work in the LA area after the fire. Yeah, and thank you also to the attendees. We do look forward to seeing you in our future sessions. And again, keep an eye out for the webinar evaluation and the two upcoming webinars.